After MobLand, watch this other Guy Ritchie gangster show that's getting a second season. What if I told you the world you saw in Snatch, Lock, Stock, and the Gentleman is real? And worse, it's growing. Beneath the streets of London, beneath the posh titles and polished names, a silent war has begun. A war Guy Ritchie saw coming years ago. But now, it's on your screen. MobLand and The Gentleman aren't just shows. They're coded messages, blueprints, warnings. One was hidden in plain sight on Netflix. The other, masked as drama on Paramount+. But both share a secret origin, one that Ritchie has been hinting at since 1998. And if you don't see what's really happening by the time this video ends, you're already late. Let's rewind the reel, shall we? In 1998, a young British director exploded onto the scene. Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels wasn't just a cult crime flick. It was an encrypted map of the London underworld. Ritchie's camera didn't just show violence. It exposed hierarchy. It revealed bloodlines. Then came Snatch, then Rock'n'Rolla. But these weren't just movies. They were testing grounds, short bursts of truth, masked as stylized fiction. Fast forward to 2019. The Gentleman movie drops. Suddenly, the violence is cleaner. The players are sharper. It's no longer street thugs fighting over scraps. It's aristocrats trading empires. A crime world in suits. It felt too real. And here's the thing no one told you. That film was just the pilot episode of something much bigger. You see, Ritchie wasn't content staying on the silver screen. Because the real game, it was always television. Episodic. Slow burning. Hidden in binge sessions and algorithmic shadows. And that's where MobLand and The Gentleman come in. Two different shows, two different streaming giants, but the same fingerprints and the same blood. Let's break them down. Released on Paramount+, MobLand looks like a standalone UK crime saga. But look closer, the Harrigan family, led by Pierce Brosnan and Helen Mirren, isn't just another gang. They're royalty, criminal nobility, and they're at war, not over money, not over drugs, but over legacy. A rival syndicate, the Stevensons, threatens everything. Tensions crackle. And in comes the cleaner, Harry D'Souza, played by Tom Hardy. He doesn't speak much, but when he does, people listen. And when he acts, people vanish. This isn't a turf war, it's a dynastic purge, a reshuffling of the criminal hierarchy of the UK. And just when you think you know the rules, Guy Ritchie pulls you into the second battlefield. On Netflix, The Gentleman tells a different story, but with eerily familiar notes. A death, a sudden inheritance. Eddie Horniman, played by Theo James, becomes Duke of Halstead. But this title comes with something more than land. It comes with a criminal empire buried beneath the soil. Enter Susie Glass, part handler, part puppet master. Together, Eddie and Susie must navigate rival factions, internal betrayal, and the pressure of being born into bloodlines you never asked for. Sound familiar? It should. Because this isn't fiction, it's a modern monarchy of crime, mapped and written by Ritchie. But why now? Why these stories? Why these two shows on separate platforms? Because we missed the real game. Everyone thinks these shows are about gangsters. They're not. They're about succession, inheritance, power that flows not through elections, but through violence. Guy Ritchie isn't just making crime shows. He's building a cinematic underworld, interconnected and expanding. And if you blink, you'll miss the signs. Why do characters across shows echo each other? Why do they all come from old families? Why do they speak like businessmen but act like butchers? Because this is the new British Empire, reborn through backroom deals and blood packs. And that's why you need to subscribe, now. Because every episode, every detail, every line of dialogue is part of a web Guy Ritchie is quietly weaving. And we're the only ones decoding it. But here's the twist. MobLand may never return. Ritchie might walk away. Or maybe he already left a backdoor in The Gentleman Season 2. The two worlds aren't rivals. They're connected. How? Well, there's one secret character, one line, one moment that links MobLand to The Gentleman in plain sight. In episode 6 of The Gentleman, a phone rings. A man answers. He doesn't speak his name, but he says one thing. The Harrigans have moved early. And just like that, two separate shows become one. MobLand, The Gentleman, same world, same war, different fronts. This isn't theory, it's design. Because Guy Ritchie doesn't write coincidences, he writes codes. The Harrigans, the ruling family of MobLand, are never shown in The Gentleman. Not directly, but they're mentioned once, under breath. Eddie Horniman hears it from an anonymous informant during a backroom deal gone wrong. You're not just dealing with the glass operation anymore, the Harrigans have sent word. At first glance, it feels like a throwaway line. But if you connect the timeline of both series, it perfectly aligns. MobLand Season 1 ends with the Harrigan Empire destabilized. One of the heirs disappears, another flees to Europe. Where in Europe? The Halstead estate, Susie Glass's home turf, and just like that, the syndicates begin to merge. When Ritchie was asked why he returned to UK crime television in back-to-back shows, he said something strange. The more time you spend with characters like these, the more you realize they already know each other. What does that mean? Think about it. 2 different shows, 2 different platforms, but both bear Ritchie's name. Both shot in overlapping locations, both use the same production studios, both hint at shared infrastructure, the same rival cartels, the same old money families, the same code of silence, and both shows avoid giving away one critical piece of information. Who's really in charge? Everyone thinks Eddie and Susie are rising to the top, everyone thinks Harry D'Souza is the big gun, but they're all wrong. Behind both stories is a single, faceless entity, the Crown Lair, never named, never shown, only referenced in symbols, a lion sigil on a document in MobLand, a black ring passed from hand to hand in The Gentleman, the words CL Division whispered during an arms trade. These aren't props, they're signatures. The real boss isn't a gangster, it's an organization so old it predates the crime families, and its motto? Order through shadow. MobLand and The Gentleman are chessboards, but the players, they're just pieces. Every viewer sees action, dialogue, plot twists, but they don't see what's buried in the subtext. These shows are training manuals for manipulation. They teach how power is transferred without elections, how aristocracy uses blood to launder crime, how every criminal empire masks itself as business, and most viewers, they binge watch it without questioning anything. But you're not most viewers. You click this video. You're watching this breakdown. You're not just interested in the plot. You want the blueprints, the mechanics, you want the forbidden knowledge. Let's rewind MobLand's final scene. Conrad Harrigan and Maeve are seen watching an old film reel. It's silent, grainy, black and white. A voiceover says, "The rules were never written, only passed down." Then Maeve looks to Conrad and says, "If they don't listen, send D'Souza to remind them who really holds the pen." This scene feels dramatic, until you realize it's a metaphor. The pen isn't a weapon, it's control over narrative. These families don't just own crime, they own the story about crime. They control what gets remembered, what gets rewritten, what gets erased, and that's what makes The Gentleman dangerous. Eddie starts the show as a nobleman, a reluctant heir, an outsider, but by episode 8, he's calling shots. Making threats, wearing darker clothes, speaking fewer words. Classic Ritchie code, power corrupts by ritual. Every episode is a transformation rite. And Susie Glass, she's not a sidekick, she's a handler. She's guiding Eddie into something deeper. Not just a boss, a figurehead. Someone to place on the throne while real power operates from behind the curtain. There's a moment in The Gentleman Season 1, Episode 4. Eddie visits a weapons cache under his estate. One crate is labeled Property of K. Harrigan, Belfast Division. That crate is never opened, never explained, never shown again. That's not an Easter egg, that's a trailhead. Ritchie is leaving breadcrumbs. For those willing to trace the connections, Harrigan, Halstead, Glass, D'Souza, they're not rivals, they're branches, a family tree of organized control. Netflix renewed The Gentleman for Season 2, and here's where it gets dangerous. The rumors say Eddie will be forced to confront a former ally of the Harrigans, but what if that ally is Harry D'Souza himself? What if Season 2 becomes the collision of both shows? MobLand's killer versus The Gentleman's strategist? Tom Hardy versus Theo James? 2 heirs to crime, 1 empire, and we are the only ones watching from above the board. But we're not done. Because page 3 is where we expose the real map, the origin of the Crown Lair, the real-life inspirations for Ritchie's criminal families, drawn from historic UK bloodlines and wartime intelligence, and the reason Guy Ritchie may never speak openly about them, because these secrets, they're based on truth, buried archives, declassified documents, and old nobility that still controls wealth and war from behind closed doors. This is no longer just a story about gangsters, it's a story about history, about how organized crime isn't separate from power, it is power. And in both MobLand and The Gentleman, Guy Ritchie has hidden a trail, a coded confession, about the real families who built empires on blood and silence. You weren't watching a crime drama, you were watching a simulation, one based on people who still walk free, still rule, still remain untouchable. The Crown Lair, Ritchie's silent, invisible syndicate, might sound like fiction, but there's precedent. In 1940s Britain, an operation codenamed Iron Bridge linked aristocrats, financiers, and ex-military agents in a covert network that funded wars and criminal ventures. Parliament never confirmed it, but MI5 records, declassified in 1998, mention a civilian auxiliary operation run out of Belfast and Essex, 2 key locations in MobLand. The symbols match: a lion crest facing left, a sealed ring with a black opal. The phrase, "by silence order reigns," all 3 appear subtly in MobLand and The Gentleman. And no, this isn't coincidence. It's coded historical fiction. The Harrigans, based on the O'Neills of Ulster, a noble family with real documented ties to wartime smuggling and secret shipping contracts. The Glass Syndicate parallels the Claremont set, a post-war London club of gamblers, spies, and media moguls who shaped UK politics and trade. Eddie Horniman's lineage, loosely inspired by the Marquis of Bath, an eccentric aristocrat whose family lost fortune during the 1980s heroin spike and was rumored to have criminal connections kept off public record. These names were altered, the events fictionalized, but the structures, the cover-ups, the alliances, the shadows behind the throne are very real. The Halstead estate is fictional, but in episode 3, there's a brief shot of a map hanging behind Eddie's desk. Freeze the frame, zoom in, the labeled location, Longleat House, the real-life ancestral home of the Marquis of Bath, a manor that once housed a private zoo, a personal vault, an underground tunnel system leading to now-collapsed war bunkers. Why use that image? Why risk legal pressure to include it? Because Ritchie is signaling something, that this world of suits, drugs, bloodlines, and betrayal isn't invented. It's remembered. Backroom deals, real tactics, real agencies. In MobLand, D'Souza arranges arms via an unnamed intermediary from the trade office. That's not fiction. Between 1974 and 1991, MI6 ran a black market laundering front called Project Clover. It sold arms to non-state actors under the guise of foreign aid, then laundered the profits into offshore accounts tied to hereditary families. One of the families connected by journalistic leaks in 2002, the descendants of a viscount, now rebranded as consultants. These people aren't in hiding. They're in boardrooms. The Gentleman Season 2 is no longer just a continuation. It's a collision course. Eddie and Susie now have power, but Season 2 will show the cost of taking the throne without permission. Rumors point to the return of Maeve Harrigan, Helen Mirren, a new rogue fixer working outside D'Souza's control, a betrayal from within the Halstead estate. But here's the kicker. Behind every twist, the Crown Layer watches, waiting, to reclaim what they believe is theirs. Every viewer focuses on the gangsters, the shootouts, the deals, the betrayals, but that's the distraction. Ritchie's real genius is this. He shows you a crime story while teaching you about systems. Power that doesn't wear a mask because it doesn't have to. MobLand and The Gentleman are lessons in perception. How to rig an economy without touching money. How to start a war without firing the first shot. How to disappear in plain sight. The game isn't drugs. The game is optics. Whoever controls the narrative controls the world. Ritchie has never confirmed a shared universe, but in a 2024 interview he said, "Crime, when done correctly, doesn't look like crime. It looks like tradition." That's the confession. These shows aren't about the fall of empires. They're about how empires never really fall. They just change names, change suits, and write the rules all over again. If you made it this far, you've seen behind the curtain, and now you understand why most people don't. Because most people still think entertainment is harmless. But MobLand and The Gentleman are not just entertainment. They are coded reflections of the world we live in. Hidden wealth. Protected bloodlines, a secret syndicate that never appears on camera because it's filming it. These shows are mirrors, and now that you've looked into them, you can't unsee what's there. Season 2 will arrive. Eddie and Susie will rise or fall. Harry D'Souza may return or be erased. But the question isn't who survives. The question is, who's writing the script? Because in the world of crime, control isn't taken with guns, it's taken with silence, with bloodlines, with symbols that only the initiated understand. And now, you're one of them.